Wind, Sand, and Stars by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Chapter 9. Barcelona and Madrid. Part 2. On the Guadalajara front, I sat at night in a dugout with a Republican squad made up of a lieutenant, a sergeant, and 3 men. They were about to go out on patrol duty. One of them, the night was cold, stood half in shadow, with his head not quite through the neck of a sweater he was pulling on, his arms caught in the sleeves, and waving slowly and awkwardly in the air, like the short arms of a bear. Smothered curses, stubbles of beard, distant muffled explosions. The atmosphere was a strange compound of sleep, waking, and death. I thought of tramps on the road bestirring themselves, raising themselves up off the ground on heavy sticks, caught in the earth, painted by the earth, their hands grubby with their gardenless gardening. These men were raising themselves painfully out of the mud in order to emerge under the stars. In these blocks of caked clay, I could sense the awakening of consciousness, and as I looked at them, I said to myself that across the way, at this very moment, the enemy was getting into his harness, was thickening his body with woolen sweaters, earth-crusted. He was breaking out of his mold of hardened mud. Across the way, the same clay shaping the same beings was wakening in the same way into consciousness. The patrol moved forward across fields through crackling stubble, knocking its toes against unseen rocks in the dark. We were making our way down into a narrow valley on the other side of which the enemy was entrenched. Caught in the crossfire of artillery, the peasants had evacuated this valley, and their deserted village lay here, drowned in the waters of war. Only their dogs remained, ghostly creatures that hunted their pitiful prey in the day and howled in the night. At 4 a.m, when the moon rose white as a picked bone, a whole village bayed at the dead divinity. "Go down and find out if the enemy is hiding in the village," the commanding officer had ordered. Very likely on the other side, the same order had been given. We were accompanied by a sort of political agent, a civilian whose name I have forgotten, though not what he looked like. It seems to me he must have been rheumatic, and I remember that he leaned heavily on a knotted stick as we tramped forward in the night. His face was the face of a conscientious and elderly workman. I would have sworn that he was above politics and parties, above ideological rivalries. "Pity it is," he would say, "that as things are, we cannot explain our point of view to the other fellow." He walked weighed down by his doctrine, like an evangelist. Across the way, meanwhile, was the other evangelist, a believer just as enlightened as this one, his boots just as muddy, his duty taking him on exactly the same errand. "You'll hear them pretty soon," my commissar said. "When we get close enough, we'll call out to the enemy, ask him questions, and he may answer tonight. Although we don't yet know it, we are in search of a gospel to embrace all gospels. We are on the march towards a stormy Sinai. And we have arrived. Here is a day's sentry, half asleep in the shadow of a stone wall." "Yes," says my commissar. "Sometimes they answer. Sometimes they call out first and ask questions. Of course they don't answer too, sometimes. Depends on the mood they're in. Just like the gods." 100 yards behind us lie our trenches. I strike a match intending to light a cigarette, and 2 powerful hands duck my head. Everybody has ducked, and I hear the whistle of bullets in the air. Then silence. The shots were fired high, and the volley was not repeated. A mere reminder from the enemy of what constitutes decorum here. One does not light a cigarette in the face of the enemy. We are joined by 3 or 4 men wrapped in blankets who had been posted behind neighboring walls. "Looks as if the lads across the way were awake," one of them remarks. Do you think they'll talk tonight? We'd like to talk to them. One of them, Antonio, he talks sometimes. Call him. The man in the blanket straightens up, cups his hand round his mouth, and takes a deep breath, and calls out, slowly and loudly, Antonio! The call swells, unfurls, floats across the wet valley, and echoes back. Better duck, my neighbor advises. Sometimes when you call them, they let fly. Crouched behind the stone wall, we listen. No sound of a shot. Yet we cannot say we have heard nothing at all, for the whole night is singing like a seashell. Hi, Antonio! Are you? The man in the blanket draws another deep breath and goes on. Are you asleep? Asleep, says the echo. Asleep, the valley asks. Asleep? The whole night wants to know. The sound fills all space. We scramble to our feet and stand erect in perfect confidence. They have not touched their guns. I stand imagining them on their side of the valley as they listen, hear, receive this human voice, this voice that obviously has not stirred them to anger since no finger has pressed the trigger. True, they do not answer. They are silent. But how attentive must be that silent audience from which a moment ago a match had sufficed to draw a volley. Born on the breeze of a human voice, invisible seeds are fertilizing that black earth across the valley. Those men thirst for our words as we for theirs. But their fingers, meanwhile, are on their triggers. They put me in mind of those wild things we would try in the desert to tame, and that would stare at us, eat the food, and drink the water we set out for them, and would spring at our throats when we made a move to stroke them. We squatted well down behind the wall, and held up a lighted match above it. 3 bullets passed overhead. To the match they said, "You are forgetting that we are at war." To us, "We are listening nevertheless. We can still love, though we stick to our rules." Another giant peasant rested his gun against the wall, stood up, drew a deep breath, and let go. "Antonio! It's me, Leo!" The sound moved across the valley like a ship new launched. 800 yards to the far shore, 800 back, 1,600 yards. If they answered, there would be 5 seconds of time between our questions and their replies. 5 seconds of silence, in which all war would be suspended, would go by between each question and each answer, like an embassy on a journey each time. What this meant was that even if they answered, we should still feel ourselves separated from them. Between them and us, the inertia of an invisible world would still be there to be stirred into action. For the considerable space of 5 seconds, we should be like men shipwrecked, and fearful lest the rescue party had not heard their cries. "Oh!" A distant voice, like a feeble wave, has curled up to die on our shore. The phrase, the word, was lost on the way, and the result is an undecipherable message. Yet it strikes me like a blow. In this impenetrable darkness a sudden flash of light has gleamed. All of us are shaken by a ridiculous hope. Something has made known to us its existence. We can be sure now that there are men across the way. It is as if in invisibility a crack had opened, as if... Imagine a house at night, dark and its doors all locked. You, sitting in its darkness, suddenly feel a breath of cold air on your face. A single breath. What a presence. There it comes again. Time. Sleep. Torn, mutilated, as a truly urgent message must be, washed by the waves and soaked in brine, here is our message. The men who fired at our cigarettes have blown up their chests with air in order to send us this motherly bit of advice. Quiet. Go to bed. Time to sleep. It excites us. You who read this will perhaps think that these men were merely playing a game. In a sense they were. I am sure that, being simple men, If you had caught them at their sport, they would have denied that it was serious. But games always cover something deep and intense, else there would be no excitement in them. No pleasure, no power to stir us. Here was a game that made our hearts beat too wildly not to satisfy a real though undefined need within us. It was as if we were marrying our enemy before dying of his blow. But so slight, so fragile, was the pontoon flung between our two shores that a question too awkward, a phrase too clumsy, would certainly upset it. Words lose themselves. Only essential words, only the truth of truths, would leave this frail bridge whole. And I can see him now, that peasant who stirred Antonio to speech, and thus made himself our pilot, our ambassador. I can see him as he stood erect, as he rested his strong hands on the low stone wall, and sent forth from his great chest that question of questions. "Antonio, what are you fighting for?" Let me say again that he and Antonio would be ashamed to think that you took them seriously. They would insist that it was all in fun. But I was there as he stood waiting, and I know that his whole soul gaped wide to receive the answer. Here is the truncated message, the secret mutilated by 5 seconds of travel across the valley as an inscription in stone is defaced by the passing of centuries. "Spain." And then I heard, "You?" He got his answer. I heard the great reply as it was flung forth into space. "The bread of our brothers." And then the amazing, "Good night, friend." And the response from the other side of the world, "Good night, friend." And silence. Their words were not the same, but their truths were identical. Why has this high communion never yet prevented men from dying in battle against each other? Back on the Madrid front, I sat again at night in a subterranean chamber, at supper with a young captain and a few of his men. The telephone had rung, and the captain was being ordered to prepare to attack before daybreak. 20 houses in this industrial suburb, Carabanchel, constituted the objective. There would be no support. One after the other, the houses were to be blown in with hand grenades and occupied. I felt vaguely squeamish as I took something like a last look at these men, who were shortly to dive into the great bowl of air, suck the blue night into their lungs, and then be blown to bits before they could reach the other side of the road. They were taking it easily enough, but the captain came back to table from the telephone shrugging his shoulders. "The first man out," he started to say something, changed his mind, pushed 2 glasses and a bottle of brandy across the table, and said to the sergeant, "You lead the file with me. Have a drink and go get some sleep." The sergeant drank and went off to sleep. Round the table a dozen of us were sitting up. All the chinks in this room were caulked up. Not a trickle of light could escape. The glare within was so dazzling that I blinked. The brandy was sweet, faintly nauseating, and its taste was as mournful as a drizzle at daybreak. I was in a daze, and when I had drunk, I shut my eyes and saw behind my lids those ruined and ghostly houses, bathed in a greenish radiance, as of moonglow under water, that I had stared at a few minutes before through the sentry's loophole. Someone on my right was telling a funny story. He was talking very fast, and I understood about 1 word in 3. A man came in half drunk, reeling gently in this half-real world. He stood rubbing a stubble of beard, and looking us over with vague, affectionate eyes. His glance slid across to the bottle, avoided it, came back to it, and turned pleadingly to the captain. The captain laughed softly, and the man, suddenly hopeful, laughed too. A light gust of laughter ran over the roomful of men. The captain put out his hand and moved the bottle noiselessly out of reach. The man's glance simulated despair, and a childish game began, a sort of mute ballet which, in the fog of cigarette smoke, and the weariness of the watch with its anticipation of the coming attack was utterly dreamlike. I sat, hypnotized by this atmosphere of the slowly ending vigil, reading the hour in the stubbles of beard, while out of doors a sea-like pounding of cannon waxed in intensity. Soon afterwards, these men were to scour themselves clean of their sweat, their brandy, the filth of their vigil in the regal waters of the night of war. I felt in them something so near to spotless purity. Meanwhile, as long as it would last, they were dancing the ballet of the drunkard and the bottle. They were determined that this game should absorb them utterly. They were making life last as long as it possibly could. But there on a shelf stood a battered alarm clock, set to sound the 0 hour. No one so much as glanced at it but me, and my glance was furtive. They would all hear it well enough, never fear. Its ringing would shatter the stifling air. The clock would ring out. These men would rise to their feet and stretch themselves. They would be sure to make this gesture, which is instinctive in every man about to tackle the problem of survival. They would stretch themselves, I say, and they would buckle on their harness. The captain would pull his revolver out of his holster, the drunk would sober up, and all these men without undue haste would file into the passage. They would go as far as that rectangle of pale light which is the sky at the end of the passage, and there they would mutter something simple like, "Look at that moon," or "What a night," and then they would fling themselves into the stars. Scarcely had the attack been called off by telephone, scarcely had these men, most of whom had been doomed to die in the attack upon that concrete wall, begun to feel themselves safe, begun to realize that they were certain of trampling their sweet planet in their rough clogs one more day. Scarcely were their minds at peace, when all in chorus began to lament their fate. "Do you think we are a lot of women? Is this a war or isn't it? A fine general staff," they grumbled sarcastically. "Can't make up its mind about anything. Wants to see Madrid bombarded and kids smashed to bits." Here they were, ready to rip up those enemy batteries and fling them over the backs of the mountains to save innocents imperiled, and the staff tied them hand and foot, condemned them to inaction. It was clear enough, and the men admitted it, that none of them might have come up again after their dive into the moonlight, and that they ought in reality to be very happy to be alive and able to grouse against GHQ, and go on drinking their consoling brandy. And by the way, since the second telephone message, two curious things had happened. The brandy tasted better, and the men were now drinking it cheerfully instead of moodily. Yet, at the same time, I saw nothing in their vehemence that made me think it either silly or boastful. I could not but remember that all of them had been ready to die with simplicity. Day broke. I scrubbed my face in the freezing water of the village pump. Coffee steamed in the bowls under an arbor, 40 yards from the enemy outpost, half wrecked by midnight firing, but safe in the truce of dawn. Now freshly washed, the survivors gathered there to commune in life rather than in death, to share their white bread, their cigarettes, their smiles. They came in one by one. Their sergeant R., the lieutenant, and the rest planted their elbows solidly on the table, and sat facing this treasure which they had been judicious enough to despise at a moment when it seemed it must be abandoned, but which had now recovered its price. "Salud, amigo!" "Hail, friend!" they sang out as they clapped one another on the shoulder. I loved the freezing wind that caressed us and the shining sun that warmed us beneath the touch of the wind. I loved the mountain air that was filling me with gladness. I rejoiced in the cheer of these men who sat in their shirt sleeves gathering fresh strength from their repast and making ready, once they had finished and risen to their feet, to knead the stuff of the world. A ripe pod burst somewhere. From time to time a silly bullet spat against a stone wall. Death was abroad, of course, but wandering aimlessly and without ill intent. This was not death's hour. We in the arbor were celebrating life. This whole platoon had risen up de profundis, and the captain sat breaking the bright white bread, that densely baked bread of Spain so rich in wheat, in order that each of his comrades, having stretched forth his hand, might receive a chunk as big as his fist, and turn it into life. These men had in truth risen de profundis. They were, in very fact, beginning a new life. I stared at them, and, in particular, at Sergeant R., he who was to have been the first man out, and who had gone to sleep in preparation for the attack. I was with them when they woke him up. Now Sergeant R. had been well aware that he was to be the first man to step out into the line of fire of a machine-gun nest, and dance in the moonlight that brief ballet at the end of which is death. His awakening had been the awakening of a prisoner in his death cell. At Carabanchel, the trenches wound among little workmen's houses whose furnishings were still in place. In one of these, a few yards from the enemy, Sergeant R. was sleeping, fully dressed, on an iron cot. When we had lighted a candle and had stuck it into the neck of a bottle, and had drawn forth out of the darkness that funeral bed, the first thing that came into view was a pair of clogs. Enormous clogs, iron-shod and studded with nails, the clogs of a sewer worker or a railway track walker. All the poverty of the world was in those clogs. No man ever strode with heavy steps through life in clogs like these. He boarded life like a longshoreman, for whom life is a ship to be unloaded. This man was shod in his tools, and his whole body was covered with the tools of his trade: cartridge belt, gun, leather harness. His neck was bent beneath the heavy collar of the draught horse. Deep in caves in Morocco you can see millstones worked by blind horses. Here, in the ruddy, wavering light of the candle, we were waking up a blind horse and sending him out to the mill. "Hi, Sergeant!" He sent forth a sigh as heavy as a wave, and turned slowly and massively over towards us, so that we saw a face still asleep and filled with anguish. His eyes were shut, and his mouth, to which clung a bubble of air, was half open like the mouth of a drowned man. We sat down on his bed and watched his laborious awakening. The man was clinging like a crab to submarine depths, grasping in his fists I know not what dark seaweed. He opened and shut his hands, pulled up another deep sigh, and escaped from us suddenly with his face to the wall, obstinate with the stubbornness of an animal refusing to die, turning its back on the slaughterhouse. "Hi, Sergeant!" Once again he was drawn up from the bottom of the sea, swam towards us, and we saw again his face in the candlelight. This time we had hobbled our sleeper. He would not get away from us again. He blinked with closed eyes, moved his mouth round as if swallowing, ran his hand over his forehead, made one great effort to sink back into his happy dreams and reject our universe of dynamite, weariness, and glacial night. But it was too late. Something from without was too strong for him. Like the punished schoolboy stirred by the insistent bell out of his dream of a schoolless world, Sergeant R. began to clothe himself in the weary flesh he had so recently shed. That flesh which in the chill of awakening was soon to know the old pains in the joints, the weight of the harness, and the stumbling race towards death. Not so much death as the discomfort of dying, the filth of the blood in which he would steep his hands when he tried to rise to his feet, the stickiness of that coagulating syrup. Not so much death as the Calvary of a punished child. One by one he stretched his arms and then his legs, bringing up an elbow, straightening a knee, while his straps, his gun, his cartridge belt, 3 grenades hanging from his belt, all hampered the final strokes of the swimmer in the sea of sleep. At last he opened his eyes, sat up on the bed, and stared at us, mumbling, "Huh, oh, are we off?" And as he spoke, he simply stretched out his hand for his rifle. "No," said the captain. "The attack has been called off. Sergeant R., let me tell you that we made you a present of your life. Just that. As much as if you had stood at the foot of the electric chair. And God knows the world sheds ink enough on the pathos of pardon at the foot of the electric chair. We brought you your pardon in extremis. No question about it. In your mind there was nothing between you and death but a thickness of tissue paper. Therefore you must forgive me my curiosity. I stared at you, and I shall never forget your face. It was a face touching and ugly, with a humped nose a little too big, high cheekbones, and the spectacles of an intellectual. How does a man receive the gift of life? I can answer that. A man sits still, pulls a bit of tobacco out of his pocket, nods his head slowly, looks up at the ceiling, and says, "Suits me." Then he nods his head again, and adds, "If they sent us a couple of platoons, the attack might have made sense. The lads would have pitched in. You'd have seen what they can do." Sergeant, Sergeant, what will you do with this gift of life? Now, Sergeant, at peace, you are dipping your head into your coffee, your bread into your coffee. You are rolling cigarettes. You are like the lad who has been told he will not be punished after all, and yet, like the rest, you are ready to start out again, tonight, on that brief dash at the end of which the only thing a man can do is kneel down. Over and over in my head there goes the question I have wanted to ask you ever since last night. Sergeant, what is it that makes you willing to die? But I know that it is impossible to ask such a question. It would offend a modesty in you which you yourself do not know to be there, but which would never forgive me. You could not answer with high-sounding words. They would seem false to you, and in truth they would be false. What language could be chaste enough for a modest man like you? But I am determined to know, and I shall try to get round the difficulty. I shall ask you seemingly idle questions, and you will answer. Tell me, why did you join up? If I understood your answer, Sergeant, you hardly know yourself. You were a bookkeeper in Barcelona. You added up your columns of figures every day, without worrying much about the struggle against the rebels. But one of your friends joined up, and then a second friend, and you were disturbed to find yourself undergoing a curious transformation. Little by little your columns of figures seemed to you futile. Your pleasures, your work, your dreams, all seemed to belong to another age. But even that was not important until one day you heard that one of your friends had been killed on the Malaga front. He was not a friend for whom you would have ever felt you had to lay down your life. Yet that bit of news swept over you, over your narrow little life, like a wind from the sea. And that morning another friend had looked at you and said, "Do we or don't we?" And you had said, "We do." You never really wondered about the imperious call that compelled you to join up. You accepted a truth which you could never translate into words, but whose self-evidence overpowered you. And while I sat listening to your story, an image came into my mind, and I understood. When the wild ducks or the wild geese migrate in their season, a strange tide rises in the territories over which they sweep. As if magnetized by the great triangular flight, the barnyard fowl leap a foot or two into the air and try to fly. The call of the wild strikes them with the force of a harpoon, and a vestige of savagery quickens their blood. All the ducks on the farm are transformed for an instant into migrant birds, and into those hard little heads, till now filled with humble images of pools and worms and barnyards, there swims a sense of continental expanse, of the breath of seas and the salt taste of the ocean wind. The duck totters to right and left in its wire enclosure, gripped by a sudden passion to perform the impossible, and a sudden love whose object is a mystery. Even so is man overwhelmed by a mysterious presentiment of truth, so that he discovers the vanity of his bookkeeping and the emptiness of his domestic felicities. But he can never put a name to this sovereign truth. Men explain these brusque vocations by the need to escape or the lure of danger, as if we knew where the need to escape and the lure of danger themselves came from. They talk about the call of duty, but what is that? But what is it that makes the call of duty so oppressing? What can you tell me, Sergeant, about that uneasiness that seeped in to disturb your peaceful existence. The call that stirred you must torment all men. Whether we adopt its sacrifice, or poetry, or adventure, it is always the same voice that calls. But domestic security has succeeded in crushing out that part in us that is capable of heeding the call. We scarcely quiver. We beat our wings once or twice and fall back into our barnyard. We are prudent people. We are afraid to let go of our petty reality in order to grasp at a great shadow. But you, Sergeant, did discover the sordidness of those shopkeepers' bustlings, those petty pleasures, those petty needs. You felt that men did not live like this, and you agreed to heed the great call without bothering to try to understand it. The hour had come when you must molt, when you must rise into the sky. The barnyard duck had no notion that his little head was big enough to contain oceans, continents, skies, but of a sudden here he was beating his wings, despising corn, despising worms, battling to become a wild duck. There is a day of the year when the eels must go down to the Sargasso Sea, and come what may, no one can prevent them. On that day they spit upon their ease, their tranquillity, their tepid waters. Off they go over ploughed fields, pricked by the hedges and skinned by the stones, in search of the river that leads to the abyss. Even so did you feel yourself swept away by that inward migration about which no one had ever said a word to you. You were ready for a sort of bridal that was a mystery to you, but in which you had to participate. Do we or don't we? We do. You went up to the front in a war that at bottom meant little to you. You took to the road as spontaneously as that silvery people shining in the fields on its way to the sea, or that black triangle in the sky. What were you after? Last night you almost reached your goal. What was it you discovered in yourself that was so ready to burst from its cocoon? At daybreak your comrades were full of complaint. Tell me, of what had they been defrauded? What had they discovered in themselves that was about to show itself, and that now they wept for? What, Sergeant, were the visions that governed your destiny and justified your risking your life in this adventure? Your life, your only treasure. We have to live a long time before we could become men. Very slowly do we plait the braid of friendships and affections. We learn slowly. We compose our creation slowly. And if we die too early, we are in a sense cheated out of our share. We have to live a long time to fulfill ourselves. But you, by the grace of an ordeal in the night which stripped you of all that was not intrinsic, you discovered a mysterious creature born of yourself. Great was this creature, and never shall you forget him. And he is yourself. You have had the sudden sense of fulfilling yourself in the instant of discovery, and you have learned suddenly that the future is now less necessary for the accumulation of treasures. That creature within you who opened his wings is not bound by ties to perishable things. He agrees to die for all men, to be swallowed up in something universal. A great wind swept through you and delivered from the matrix the sleeping prince you sheltered, man within you. You are the equal of the musician composing his music, of the physicist extending the frontier of knowledge, of all those who build the highways over which we march to deliverance. Now you are free to gamble with death. What have you now to lose? Let us say you were happy in Barcelona. Nothing more can ruin that happiness. You have reached an altitude where all loves are of the same stuff. Perhaps you suffered on earth, felt yourself alone on the planet, knew no refuge to which you might fly. What of that, Sergeant? This day you have been welcomed home by love. No man can draw a free breath who does not share with other men a common and disinterested ideal. Life has taught us that love does not consist in gazing at each other, but in looking outward together in the same direction. There is no comradeship except through union in the same high effort. Even in our age of material well-being, this must be so, else how should we explain the happiness we feel in sharing our last crust with others? In the desert. No sociologist's textbook can prevail against this fact. Every pilot who has flown to the rescue of a comrade in distress knows that all joys are in vain in comparison with this one. And this, it may be, is the reason why the world today is tumbling about our ears. It is precisely because this sort of fulfillment is promised each of us by his religion that men are inflamed today. All of us, in words that contradict each other, express at bottom the same exalted impulse. What sets us against one another is not our aims. They all come to the same thing. But our methods, which are the fruit of our varied reasoning. Let us then refrain from astonishment at what men do. One man finds that his essential manhood comes alive at the sight of self-sacrifice, cooperative effort, a rigorous vision of justice manifested in an anarchist cellar in Barcelona. For that man there will henceforth be but one truth, the truth of the anarchists. Another, having once mounted guard over a flock of terrified little nuns kneeling in a Spanish nunnery, will thereafter know a different truth, that it is sweet to die for the Church. If, when Mermos plunged into the Chilean Andes with victory in his heart, you had protested to him that no merchant's letter could possibly be worth risking one's life for, Mermos would have laughed in your face. Truth is, the man that was born in Mermos when he slipped through the Andes, when the Andean passes. Consider that officer of the South Moroccan Rifles who, during the war in the Rif, was in command of an outpost set down between two mountains filled with enemy tribesmen. One day, down from the mountain to the west came a group seeking a parley. Arabs and Frenchmen were talking over their tea, when of a sudden a volley rang out. The tribesmen from the other mountain were charging the post. When the commandant sought to dismiss his guests before fighting off their allies, they said to him, "Today we are your guests. God will not allow us to desert you." They fought beside his men, saved the post, and then climbed back into their eyrie. But on the eve of the day when their turn had come to pounce upon the post, they sent again to the commandant. "We came to your aid the other day," their chief said. "True." "We used up 300 of our cartridges for you." "Very likely." "It would be only just that you replaced them for us." The commandant was an officer and a gentleman. They were given their cartridges. True for any man is that which makes him a man. A man who has fraternized with men on this high plane, who has displayed the sportsmanship and has seen the rules of the game, so nobly observed on both sides in matters of life and death, is obviously not to be mentioned in the same breath with the shabby, hardy demagogue, who would have expressed his fraternity with the Arabs by a great clap on the shoulders and a spate of flattering words that would have humiliated them. You might argue with the captain that all was fair in war, but if you did, he would feel a certain pitying contempt for you. And he would be right. Meanwhile, you are equally right to hate war. If our purpose is to understand mankind and its yearnings, to grasp the essential reality of mankind, we must never set one man's truth against another's. All beliefs are demonstrably true. All men are demonstrably in the right. Anything can be demonstrated by logic. I say that a man is right who blames all the ills of the world upon hunchbacks. Let us declare war on hunchbacks, and in the twinkling of an eye all of us will hate them fanatically. All of us will join to avenge the crimes of the hunchbacks. Assuredly, hunchbacks too do commit crimes. But if we are to succeed in grasping what is essential in man, we must put aside the passions that divide us, and that, once they are accepted, sow in the wind a whole Koran of unassailable verities and fanaticisms. Nothing is easier than to divide men into rightists and leftists, hunchbacks and straightbacks, fascists and democrats, and these distinctions will be perfectly just. But truth, we know, is that which clarifies, not that which confuses. Truth is the language that expresses universality. Newton did not discover a law that lay hidden from man like the answer to a rebus. He accomplished a creative operation. He founded a human speech which could express at one and the same time the fall of an apple and the rising of the sun. Truth is not that which is demonstrable, but that which is ineluctable. There is no profit in discussing ideologies. If all of them are logically demonstrable, then all of them must contradict one another. To agree to discuss them is tantamount to despairing of the salvation of mankind, whereas everywhere about us men manifest identical yearnings. What all of us want is to be set free. The man who sinks his pickaxe into the ground wants that stroke to mean something. The convict's stroke is not the same as the prospector's, for the obvious reason that the prospector's stroke has meaning and the convict's stroke has none. It would be a mistake to think that the prison exists at the point where the convict's stroke is dealt. Prison is not a mere physical horror. It is using a pickaxe to no purpose that makes a prison. The horror resides in the failure to enlist all those who swing the pick in the community of mankind. We all yearn to escape from prison. There are 200 million men in Europe whose existence has no meaning, and who yearn to come alive. Industry has torn them from the idiom of their peasant lineage, and has locked them up in those enormous ghettos that are like railway yards heaped with blackened trucks. Out of the depths of their slums these men yearn to be awakened. There are others, caught in the wheels of 1,000 trades, who are forbidden to share in the joys known to a mermas, to a priest, to a man of science. Once it was believed that to bring these creatures to manhood, it was enough to feed them, clothe them, and look to their everyday needs. But we see now that the result of this has been to turn out petty shopkeepers, village politicians, hollow technicians devoid of an inner life. Some indeed were well taught, but no one troubled to cultivate any of them. People who believe that culture consists in the capacity to remember formulae have a paltry notion of what it is. Of course, any science student can tell us more about nature and her laws than can Descartes or Newton. But what can he tell us about the human spirit? With more or less awareness, all men feel the need to come alive. But most of the methods suggested for bringing this about are snares and delusions. Men, of course, can be stirred into life by being dressed up in uniforms and made to blare out chants of war. It must be confessed that this is one way for men to break bread with comrades and to find what they are seeking, which is a sense of something universal, of self-fulfillment. But of this bread men die. It is easy to dig up wooden idols and revive ancient and more or less workable myths, like Pan-Germanism or the Roman Empire. The Germans can intoxicate themselves with the intoxication of being Germans and compatriots of Beethoven. A stoker in the hold of a freighter can be made drunk with this drink. What is more difficult is to bring up a Beethoven out of the stokehold. These idols in sum are carnivorous idols. The man who dies for the progress of science or the healing of the sick serves life in his very dying. It may be glorious to die for the expansion of territory, but modern warfare destroys what it claims to foster. The day is gone when men sent life coursing through the veins of a race by the sacrifice of a little blood. War carried on by gas and bombing is no longer war. It is a kind of bloody surgery. Each side settles down behind a concrete wall and finds nothing better to do than to send forth night after night squadrons of planes to bomb the guts of the other side, blow up its factories, paralyze its production, and abolish its trade. Such a war is won by him who rots last, but in the end, both rot together. In a world become a desert, we thirst for comradeship. It is the savor of bread token with comrades that makes us accept the values of war. But there are other ways than war to bring us the warmth of a race. Shoulder to shoulder towards an identical goal. War has tricked us. It is not true that hatred adds anything to the exaltation of the race. Why should we hate one another? We all live in the same cause, are born through life on the same planet, form the crew of the same ship. Civilizations may indeed compete to bring forth new syntheses, but it is monstrous that they should devour one another. To set man free, it is enough that we help one another to realize that there does exist a goal towards which all mankind is striving. Why should we not strive towards that goal together, since it is what unites us all. The surgeon pays no heed to the moanings of his patient, beyond that pain it is man he is seeking to heal. That surgeon speaks a universal language. The physicist does the same when he ponders those almost divine equations in which he seizes the whole physical universe from the atom to the nebula. Even the simple shepherd, modestly watching his sheep under the stars, would discover, once he understood the part he was playing, that he was something more than a servant, was a sentinel, and each sentinel among men is responsible for the whole of the empire. It is impossible not to believe that the shepherd wants to understand. One day, on the Madrid front, I chanced upon a school that stood on a hill surrounded by a low stone wall some 500 yards behind the trenches. A corporal was teaching botany that day. He was lecturing on the fragile organs of a poppy held in his hands. Out of the surrounding mud, and in spite of the wandering shells that dropped all about, he had drawn like a magnet an audience of stubble-bearded soldiers who squatted tailor fashion and listened with their chins in their hands to a discourse of which they understood not a word in 5. Something within them had said, "You are but brutes fresh from your caves. Go along, catch up with humanity." And they had hurried on their muddy clogs to overtake it. It is only when we become conscious of our part in life, however modest, that we shall be happy. Only then will we be able to live in peace and die in peace, for only this lends meaning to life and to death. Death is sweet when it comes in its time, and in its place, when it is part of the order of things, when the old peasant of Provence, at the end of his reign, remits into the hands of his sons his parcel of goats and olive trees, in order that they, in their turn, transmit them to their sons. When one is part of a peasant lineage, one's death is only half a death. Each life in turn bursts like a pod, and sends forth its seed. I stood once with 3 peasants in the presence of their dead mother. Sorrow filled the room. For a second time the umbilical cord had been cut. For a second time the knot had been loosed, the knot that bound one generation to another. Of a sudden the 3 sons had felt themselves alone on earth, with everything still to be learned. The magnetic pole around which they had lived was gone. Their mother's table, where they had collected on feast days with their families, was no more. But I could see in this rupture that it was possible for life to be granted a second time. Each of these sons was now to be the head of a family, was to be a rallying point and a patriarch, until that day when each would pass on the staff of office to the brood of children now murmuring in the courtyard. I looked at their mother, at the old peasant with the firm, peaceful face, the tight lips, the human face transformed into a stone mask. I saw in it the faces of her sons. That mask had served to mold theirs. That body had served to mold the bodies of these 3 exemplary men who stood there as upright as trees. And now she lay broken but at rest, a vein from which the gold had been extracted. In their turn, her sons and daughters would bring forth men from their mold. One does not die on a farm. Their mother is dead. Long live their mother. Sorrowful, yes, but so simple was this image of a lineage dropping one by one its white-haired members, as it made its way through time and through its metamorphosis towards a truth that was its own. That same day, when the tocsin tolled to announce to the countryside the death of this old woman, it seemed to me not a song of despair, but a discreet and tender chant of joy. In that same voice the church bell celebrated birth and death, christening and burial, the passage from one generation to the next. I was suffused with a gentle peace of soul at this sound which announced the betrothal of a poor old woman and the earth. This was life that was handed on here from generation to generation with the slow progress of a tree's growth, but it was also fulfillment. What a mysterious ascension, from a little bubbling lava, from the vague pulp of a star, From a living cell miraculously fertilized, we have issued forth and have bit by bit raised ourselves to the writing of cantatas and the weighing of nebulae. This peasant mother had done more than transmit life. She had taught her sons a language, had handed on to them the lot so slowly garnered through the centuries, the spiritual patrimony of traditions, concepts, and myths that make up the whole of the difference between Newton or Shakespeare and the caveman. What we feel when we are hungry, when we feel that hunger which drew the Spanish soldiers under fire towards that botany lesson, drew mermas across the South Atlantic, draws a man to a poem, is that the birth of man is not yet accomplished, that we must take stock of ourselves and our universe. We must send forth pontoons into the night. There are men unaware of this, imagining themselves wise and self-regarding because they are indifferent. But everything in the world gives the lie to their wisdom. Comrades of the air, I call upon you to bear me witness. When have we felt ourselves happy men?